weeks, the Constitution at the Crossroads. This is a series that's being organized jointly by the India International Center and the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. And our topic today is the rather mysteriously titled Article 282, Fiscal Federalism and Centrally Sponsored Schemes, Scratching the Surface. I say mysteriously titled for a very simple reason, that throughout my entire legal education of over a decade, Article 282 never really made it to our syllabi. It wasn't discussed in law school. In fact, I didn't even know of the existence of the provision of the Constitution. But it was only when working with the 14th Finance Commission that as a lawyer, I was intrigued by how such a provision, which has really flown under the radar for most lawyers, can play such an outsized role in the governance of the country. So Article 282, for those who know, has been routinely used to authorize centrally sponsored schemes, and think of the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan or the National Health Mission or any other scheme that is critical in the governance of the country, and chances are high that they are a centrally sponsored scheme. Now, over the years, CSSs have proliferated, and Article 282 of the Constitution has been the means that have authorized the centrally sponsored schemes. From the point of view of a constitutional lawyer, Article 282 appears clear as day, that it is agnostic to purpose and agnostic to whether the matter is a central or a state subject, allowing grants to be made by the union without any restrictions. At a time when federalism is on top of the political agenda, we felt it would be an opportune moment to discuss this topic, which may have been otherwise mysterious, but really should be front and center of the public discourse today. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. N.K. Singh. Mr. N.K. Singh, everybody knows him. He wears many hats, sometimes all at the same time. Most recently, he has been the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, which has produced an excellent and voluminous report, which includes the issue of centrally sponsored schemes. And previously, he has been a secretary to the Government of India and a member of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha. And I'm delighted to welcome you, Mr. Singh, to this conversation. I'm equally delighted. Thank you, Mr. Singh. I'm equally delighted to welcome Yamini Iyer. Yamini is the president and the chief executive of the Center for Policy Research. Many of us know her originally as the brain behind the Accountability Initiative at the CPR, where she did pioneering work on public finance and public policy. One of the areas that Yamini has looked at very closely during her research are centrally sponsored schemes and the design of centrally sponsored schemes. And so we're delighted that Yamini, you could be here with us today. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
And the context for this report is a recent report. The context for this discussion, is a recent report that was published by my colleagues at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, titled Fiscal Federalism and Centrally Sponsored Schemes, Rethinking Article 282 of the Constitution. So let me now call upon my colleague Ritvika Sharma, who's the lead author of the report and the head of Charkha, the Constitutional Law Center at Vidhi, to give you a short introduction into this subject. Ritvika, over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. Thanks very much, Olga, for the introduction and for setting the context of this research report. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ritvika Sharma, and I lead the Constitutional Law Research at Vidhi. It was an absolute pleasure to work on this report on Article 282 and Fiscal Federalism in India. One of the avowed aims of Charkha, the Constitutional Law Center at Vidhi, is to take deep dives into relatively underexplored parts or provisions of the Constitution. And that is exactly what we aim to do with this report. Before we jump into the panel discussion today, I would like to take a few minutes and present an overview of our report. My strategic aim with this short presentation is to give you insights on what we did under this research project and how. I call my aim strategic because I do want everyone in the audience to eventually read the report, which is why I will be concise and not give away the entire content of the report here. Before I start, is my screen visible? Is the presentation visible? Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll jump straight into it. The starting point for our research here was expenditure in the area of public health, which obviously, for very obvious reasons, gained renewed interest last year and is obviously of particular interest even now. Public health, as we know, is a state subject, and our report takes a detailed look at the development of the practice of intergovernmental transfers, especially those under Article 282, by using public health as a sort of pivot for our research. So I'll take you through the purpose, the process, very briefly through the findings and the recommendations of our report, of our research report. On the purpose, as I just mentioned, considering that the prompt for our research came from healthcare expenditure, our research inevitably took us to the CSSs which dominate the universe of healthcare. CSSs have routinely pertained to subjects under list 2, which is the state list, as well as the list 3, which is the concurrent list over both the center and the states have legislative competence. National Health Mission and Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan are both examples that Orgu has just quoted, are on health and education respectively, both subjects which are not under list 1, which is the exclusive competence, legislative and administrative competence of the union government. Now, while the constitutional grounding for CSSs is to be found in Article 282, a study of this provision in isolation from other provisions on intergovernmental transfers would have been rather futile. And this is where our research pitches in. It analyzes Article 282 and sees how it came to be used for giving effect to CSSs. At the same time, we conduct a detailed historical analysis of Part 12 of the Constitution, which is see exactly how those provisions came to be. And once having done that historical research, we position the practice of Article 282 against the background of the constitutional scheme of fiscal federalism. Very quickly, our historical research encompasses a survey of the drafting provisions governing center-state financial relations. And we go the whole hog by looking at the report of the Joint Committee on Indian Constitutional Reform, which preceded the Government of India Act of 1935. We surveyed the deliberations of the Expert Committee on Financial Provisions of the Union Constitution, which is constituted to examine the provisions, the financial provisions in the Government of India Act. And of course, we also looked at the Constituent Assembly debates. To marry our historical research with the practice of Article 282, we surveyed Finance Commission reports and Finance Commission reports from back in the day, as well as several other reports of other studies which have been commissioned by the government. Without going into the intricate details, I would like to take everyone through some of the pertinent findings which emerged from the research that we conducted. Firstly, as you can see, on the constitutional scheme of fiscal relations between the center and the states, there were discussions. There were certainly discussions, some of them rather detailed, on specific aspects concerning financial relations, as well as the scope of the Finance Commission's role and functions. No suspicion, however, was evinced on the part of the provinces that fiscal support from the union, particularly at a time when we're talking of drafting of the constitution, fiscal support from the union would not come at the cost of states' autonomy, the provincial autonomy. At the same time, the Finance Commission was envisaged to be an independent constitutional body to effect seamless intergovernmental transfers. In fact, Austin has a rather interesting observation here. He said that unlike several other post-colonial constitutions where the specifics of intergovernmental transfers were incorporated in the text of the constitution, India seemed to have, provinces in India put a lot of faith in the Finance Commission and post-constitutional machinery to not suspect how intergovernmental transfers or grants from the center to the states would have panned out. Article 282 remained bereft of any detailed discussion. Nonetheless, the scheme of financial relations remained cognizant of the fact that grants and transfers from the center notwithstanding, the provinces needed to be facilitated with independent funds of their own so as to not remain dependent on the center for their developmental needs. We also had certain revelations on the practice of CSSs and its impact on fiscal federalism, the specifics of which can be found in the report. Now, post-1950, intergovernmental transfers broad spanned across two institutions, the Finance Commission and the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission, as we know, is not envisaged or set up under the Constitution. It was established, it was the product of a cabinet resolution, and so was the National Development Council, the NDC, as you mentioned here. So the Planning Commission as well as the NDC stood at the hem of affairs insofar as recommending tied and untied grants to states to meet their socio-economic needs was concerned. CSSs were also conceptualized and implemented based on recommendations of the Commission and the NDC. Now, routed via Article 282, transfers via CSSs were largely discretionary, coupled with the fact that they were also touching upon aspects under List 2 and List 3. And very soon, as we know, transfers via CSSs became a pain point for the fiscal federal architecture of the Constitution. The most interesting parts of our research were passing through the opinions tendered by eminent scholars, eminent constitutional law scholars to the Finance Commission, which is the third part of our findings here on the interpretation that Article 282 ought to be given. Now, during the tenure of the Ninth Finance Commission, particularly, two pertinent issues emerged. The first one concerned the true remit of Article 282 and whether it permits transfer of funds by the center to the states or by one state to another for specific public purposes only. Public purpose is a term that actually appears in Article 282. Or does it also enable the center to make transfers freely for purposes outside their respective jurisdictions? The second issue pertained to the role of the Finance Commission with respect to recommending transfers under Article 282. Now, the shorter response to both these issues is currently on our screen. Mr. K.K. Venugopal is currently the Attorney General for India. He tendered a detailed opinion to the Ninth Finance Commission. And he said that Article 282 is not envisaged to be a regular channel of transfers, and that the Finance Commission is empowered to recommend grants under Article 282 as well. The longer response to both these issues entailed a discussion on the interplay between all constitutional provisions concerning intergovernmental transfers and the distribution of legislative heads between the center and states as per the list system. On the fourth aspect of our findings, we have also devoted a small section of our report to the existing critique of the use of Article 282 to effect discretionary transfers from the center to the states. So right from the first Administrative Reforms Commission dating back to 1966 to the 15th Finance Commission in 2021. And in between, we had the Raja Mannar Committee, the Sarkaria Commission, as well as the Punchi Commission, also critiquing Article 282 grants and for the very wide expanse for which Article 282 grants were being used. I've even extracted a statement from the Raja Mannar Committee report where it said that Article 282 was not intended to make grants tied with conditions to states, and devolution of funds from the center to the states should not be at the absolute discretion of the center. And as I said, like the critique has existed since far too long now. Having said all of this, and by this I refer to the critique of discretionary transfers and CSSs, we need to remain mindful of the fact that in accordance with the 2010 Supreme Court judgment in Bhim Singh versus Union of India, the use of Article 282 to channel transfers via CSSs is not unconstitutional. So in a universe where Bhim Singh is the current law of the land and a significant number of CSSs are currently operational, the practical next step, as we have also recommended in this report, would be to imagine Article 282 in a way which does not erode the fiscal autonomy of states. In our recommendations, some of and parts of which I've extracted here, in our recommendations, we've surveyed certain judgments of the Supreme Court which have used federalism as a principle for interpreting provisions of the Constitution. Now, a major development, and I must mention here, a major development in the use of federalism in constitutional interpretation was its inclusion in the basic structure for the the landmark Keshwananda Bharti judgment. Now, although originally meant as a test to judicially review constitutional amendments, elements of the basic structure have also been used by the Supreme Court to interpret existing constitutional provisions. And the same, federalism also has become an important tool or a principle for interpreting provisions of the Constitution. And this interpretive practice is rather well established now. I've cited two examples here where the landmark Bomai judgment has used the has relied on the federal principle being part of the basic structure to interpret Article 356. A relatively recent judgment on Jindal Stainless Steel used the federal principle to interpret provisions in Part 13, which is on the trade and commerce, the provisions relating to trade and commerce. The core idea underlying our recommendation is that constitutional provisions should not be interpreted in a manner that leads to the subversion of the federal structure. In the particular context of Article 282, this means that the provision should be interpreted in a manner which upholds the Constitution's federal structure as well as the intentions of the framers. In effect, this must imply that the use of discretionary transfers under Article 282 should not supplant the major routes of fiscal transfers to the states, such as tax devolutions under Article 270 or grants in aid under Article 275. Rather, these discretionary grants should merely supplement those channels on a temporary basis and possibly for a special or exceptional case. I'll stop right here and leave you with this last slide, which has a structure or the chapterization of our report, hoping that this, along with everything that I just said, would pique everyone's interest in Article 282 and fiscal federalism. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Over to you, Argo.
Thanks very much, Ritvika, for setting this up so nicely. I think that's a nice segue to move to Mr. N.K. Singh to share his opening remarks, particularly based on his recent experience as the chairperson of the 15th Finance Commission and his much longer experience as a bureaucrat with the Government of India. Over to you, Mr. Singh.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Aga, for this opportunity to participate in the second of your Bridges and Breaks, the Constitution at Crossroads. And let me begin by congratulating the authors, Ritvika, Mayuri, and Kevin James, for this outstanding piece of research, which I found exceedingly readable. In fact, as I was telling Ritvika the other day, that I have spoken during my tenure as the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, whose shadows, by the way, you will continue to suffer or enjoy, depending on where you are placed, till 2026, because we were one of the unique commissions which was asked to give an award not for 5 but for 6 years, first year being 2021, and therefore this report is already underway. The issues which have been raised in this report, both by Ritvika and her colleagues, and the issues which have been very clearly outlined, raise several important other policy domain issues. And I think, notwithstanding the clarity of her presentation, I find that the entire range of the interrelationship between the 7th schedule, between 282, between 280, between 275 remains a clutter. And I think that it is a clutter because it is all right. My first observation is that the Bhim Singh issue was, you must remember, in a particular context. And that particular context should not be really made a generic way of testing the extent to which the provisions of Article 282 undercut the basic framework of the architecture on federalism in this country. So as I look at these distortions, I will point out to only 3 distortions, and then would be happy to join the other panelists in redressing this. First and foremost, what does 280 and 275 enjoin the Finance Commission to do? Very briefly speaking, and you know that the first Finance Commission came before the independence, because for the period 49 to 52, there was an interim Finance Commission headed by C.D. Deshmukh. And then that first Finance Commission came for the first period which we had. And this is the 15th Finance Commission, whose report is currently under implementation by the government. It had enjoined under the Constitution 2 basic functions. In simpler language, it enjoins what is known as the vertical split, namely taking an aggregation of all the revenues which could be aggregated, what proportion of that should be left with the union government, and what proportion of it should be distributed among the subnational governments or to states, in whichever way you take it. And the second important consideration was that having settled how much should go to the states, what should be a normative formula on the basis of which there should be interstate distribution of these resources among the states. In addition, of course, the broad provision was that any other matter which the president might refer to the Finance Commission in the interest of sound finance. So the words for the Constitution has used in the interest of sound finance. Over a period of time, the interpretation of this term sound finance has only kept growing, which has given more and more areas seeking the Finance Commission's recommendations. Generally speaking, the experience has been that in respect of the financial awards, governments so far have respected the recommendations of the Finance Commission to be in the nature of an award and have accepted the core recommendations, namely the vertical split. There has been not one case where there has been a deviation. And then the grants given under Article 275, which incidentally, Ritvika, I think you are absolutely right. In theory, nothing inhibits the Finance Commission for making grants under Article 282 for subjects which may or may not have been covered by any centrally sponsored schemes and so on. But in practice, it has come to mean revenue deficit grants. Now, I must explain a second on what I call revenue deficit grants. So as a commission, what we do is we make a normative assessment of the inescapable revenue expenditure of a state. We also make a normative assessment of the likely tax buoyancy and the likely taxes which are to be realized. And if we find that in no reasonable way, given the need for ensuring fiscal stability and given the need for states to improve their revenue buoyancy, the gap is usually covered in such manner as the Finance Commission considers appropriate, and the gap, therefore, between inescapable revenue expenditure and the maximum revenue tax buoyancy is bridged by what is known as the revenue deficit grant. This is how it has worked so far. Now, what are the complications in this scenario? The first complication, which you very rightly pointed out, Ritvika, is the complication that the first Finance Commission comes at a time which is identical, the same time. In 1950, the Planning Commission emerges by a cabinet resolution. So, what's the first consequence of this? On a lighter vein, and I'm sure that some of you will appreciate, on a lighter vein, Yamini, it might interest you that in the college where I went, where your father also went, the St. Stephen's College, I was speaking to, giving an interview. And one of the girls who interviewed me asked me about this. And I said, you know, when the Planning Commission was created in 1950, the then finance minister, who after having presented two budgets, Mathai, but presented the budget in 48, presented the budget in 49, but resigned in 1950 on the ground that the Planning Commission had emerged as an extra constitutional body, which was going to seriously undercut the role of the Ministry of Finance in the overall management of the finances. In practice, that's the origin of the use or misuse of Article 282. And it went through a tumultuous history because at that time, this P.C. Mahalanobis, an eminent economist, had begun to play an important role, and therefore protesting against that and protesting against the emergence of this extra constitutional authority, the then serving finance minister quit. Nothing happened, things carried on, and then the Article 282 became more and more embedded. In practice, it meant that over all these years, the Finance Commission got increasingly boxed, and we are the only unboxed Finance Commission. The Finance Commission got boxed into what came to be known as the revenue expenditure of the Union and the revenue expenditure of the states, while the Planning Commission, from the gross budgetary support which it received, began to become almost a parallel entity for promoting a number of centrally sponsored schemes. Now, we were the first finance commission. A, planning commission was abolished. B, the distinction between plan and non-plan expenditure also got abolished almost at the same time, which has other implications. Therefore, the clutter, there was an opportunity which we had of trying to remove that one big clutter. We did make an attempt and have made an attempt in our recommendations to slightly clean up the clutter. Yamini will talk about it. I do not wish to take on something that Yamini would be, because that's a part 2 of it. But let me say that when we did a review of all centrally sponsored schemes, 2 conclusions emerged. First, that as your report very rightly points out, and as we have rightly pointed out in those very words in the Finance Commission, that the transfers outside the Finance Commission do occupy and foreclose a very substantial part of the total revenue, and which is not available to the states when we make our distribution between whatever formula we use. We ended up in using same 42 or 41% as the 14th, given the fact that J&K went away. So is this a reasonable interpretation which the constitutional forefathers would have wanted? That the Finance Commissioners ab initio denied the opportunity for a total visit to all the revenue receipts for purposes of distribution between the center and the states. And did the Bhim Singh judgment look at this aspect of the extent to which the role of the Finance Commission over successive governments had been undercut by the proliferation of the centrally sponsored schemes? The proliferation, I do not only mean in numbers. Yes, when we did the last reckoning, we have given the number, but they have been clubbed together. But leaving aside the clubbing of together, and our recommendations on clubbing them further have been in principle accepted by the Ministry of Finance. But the fact remains that these are umbrella schemes. Under the umbrella schemes, there are sub-schemes and sub-schemes. So the fact remains that the clutter is very much there. The centrally sponsored schemes remain more or less where they were. In fact, in the last 2 years, the extent of the revenues which have been foreclosed by the centrally sponsored schemes have tended to go up. So what does this mean for the future of this Finance Commission and future Finance Commissions? We went into this. Then that is the real politique on which Argha would like you to focus on, and that is also anecdotal. It was told to me by a senior policy maker that, look here, if you wiped out all the centrally sponsored schemes and did exactly what was the expectation of the 14th Finance Commission, and since you have worked, Arga, with the 14th Finance Commission, and Yamini would be very familiar, when they suddenly increased the vertical devolution from 32 to 42, the expectations were that this would really result in a much greater and a much deeper rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes, and would therefore restore pristine issues of fiscal federalism as was designed by those who had devised the constitution. Alas, that did not happen, which we know very well. That did not happen. It more or less remained where they were. But this policy maker raised an interesting point which may relates not to the statute, but which relates to the real politique. And that was this, that looking at the fact in which the world has moved over from an increasingly embracing a more and more centralist model of governance, both for the states and for federal entities, can the Prime Minister, in whose name any Prime Minister of any government, I don't mean this one, but there have been many Prime Ministers during the history of the 15th Finance, can that prime minister visiting a state, when a distress is brought out, can he say, oh, by the way, I can talk about defense, I can talk about foreign policy, as far as this issue on this immediate distress, on drought, on employment is concerned, I will convey your sentiment immediately, directly to the chief minister, who is more often than not. Is that a reasonable approach in a kind of a parliamentary democracy where after all, it is the will of the electorate, for which and to subserve which ultimately all institutions are designed? A reasonable propensity to uphold the integrity of what the constitutional original structure would have been. I do not want to go that, but I want to raise three small issues and then stop there. First, the issues of 280, 275, 282 go far beyond what this outstanding paper does. Let me give you an example. Now, as all of us know, that in the original scheme of 280, at that time, the third tier of government, on which Yamini is the has got great domain knowledge, the third tier of government had not come into play. It has come into play by two constitutional amendments, 74th, 75th Amendment, and the finance commissions are not obliged to give any resources, but obliged to only fulfill another constitutional provision of augmenting the consolidated fund of the state to make the adequate resources available to the third tier. But successive finance commissions, after the enactment of these constitutional amendments, have made generous grants. In fact, the Finance Commission, which I had the privilege to head, made a very, very large increase in the devolutions to the third tier. I obviously did so under, I did not know whether I was doing it under Article 282 or under Article 275, or did so in pursuance of Article 280 and the presidential reference, which wanted me to also look at the issues of the third tier. But clearly, they were outside the original scheme of things. And that's a subsequent development, much after the Constitution was adopted. The second example, so obviously, Article 282, we all agree, was designed to give flexibility. How is that flexibility to be exercised? My view, that is still an open question, both in terms of testing its validity in a larger context than has been circumscribed by the Heaps judgment. There's another important area, the whole issue of disaster and disaster management. Not an issue which was originally conceived of at the time of the Constitution being drafted, but that continues to be a very important source on which successive finance commissions, including the 15th Finance Commission, have made very liberal provisions, both for the State Disaster Management Fund, which resources go directly to the states, and to the National Disaster Management Fund, which is supposed to be used. And indeed, it is under this provision that during the pandemic, the Ministry of Home Affairs permitted the use of the State Disaster Management Fund and the use of the National Disaster Management Fund for financing some aspects of connected with the pandemic. That's also outside the scope. So when we did make those large provisions, I'm not very sure of whether I was doing it under Article 280, 275, or Article 282, but these provisions were made in pursuance of the presidential directive. I'll stop that aspect there. But there are other complications. One complication which we need to take forward is, Arga, you mentioned, and Ritvika, you mentioned about the Part 12 of the Constitution as being central in the division of the financial powers. I think that certainly in the work that I'm doing, I'm looking at the clutter created by GST and the extent to which far-reaching constitutional amendments in the Part 12 of that constitution has been made, and the constitution of the GST Council. I say this because the Finance Commission is not a permanent body. Indeed, we should not be pleading for self-perpetuation, but in most other federations of this nature, the Australian or the South African and so on, the commission which assigns this is a continuing body. In our case, that's an issue on which the Constitution said. But the reason why it has become more relevant today is because the GST Council is a permanent constitutional entity. We make the split on the vertical. We devolve on the basis of certain assumptions. Those assumptions, we have made the award for 6 years, can get undercut by the changes to be affected by the GST Council. Also because there is no recourse mechanism in respect of states are concerned. That's an area where the Constitution is quite silent. What is the recourse mechanism? Give you an example on the recourse mechanism. Remember in the first part of some observation which I made, I said, how do I decide on the revenue deficit grants? I told you the methodology which is all finance commissions have employed and the methodology which I employed. So I went to an important hill state in North India. I went to Uttarakhand. And the chief minister at that time and the entire cabinet said, we have been ruined by the outcome of the last finance commission. Leave the finance commission out. So I said, what did they do? They made unrealistic assumptions, sir, on our FD buoyancy, and they made unrealistic assumptions on the compression of inescapable revenue expenditure. And therefore, we are in this very dire financial situation. Now, leave that anecdote aside. In case the projections which are being made for a 5-year period or for a 6-year period go horribly wrong, do the states have to wait for the next finance commission, which will in this case come in 2026, to be able to effect some important critical changes? When, in fact, apart from this, the permanent body, which is the GST Council, has the flexibility, very rightly so. That is a very novel change. In fact, it's the best example of cooperative federalism in terms of pooled sovereignty. GST Council is one of the best examples which India can hold of not only working cooperative federalism, but where sovereignty can be pooled for purposes of larger benefits. But these are issues also which are germane when we look at the working of Article 280, 275, and 282. There are other issues which complicate the picture. You look at the issue, for instance, how, and thank you so much, Ritvika, for as the last page in your report, which highlights once again the ambit of the 7th schedule of the Constitution. It sharply brings out how much have we acted, and how further we have moved away from the original assignment of the subjects contained in the lists which you have appended in your outstanding report. And therefore, I believe, as one final comment, this is time for us to go to the drawing board and to revisit the contours and the entries in the 7th schedule based on contemporary realities and based on the far-reaching changes which have taken place, both on the working of the central government and the working of the states. And that, I think, is the medium-term challenge which those of us interested in the issue of fiscal federalism need to apply, my mind. Thank you very much. I've overstepped your welcome. I apologize greatly to Arga. I apologize greatly to Ritvika for having overstepped the time. These were some issues which I thought I'd bring before you.
Not at all, Mr. Singh. Thank you very much for that really professorial overview of the history of center-state federal relations and the very provocative questions at the end. And I have a few thoughts on them, but I'm going to hold my horses at this point of time, because one of the topics that you mentioned was the fundamental change of scenario that your Finance Commission encountered because the Planning Commission was no longer there and schemes were so-called rationalized into some umbrella schemes. And I think that provides a great segue to Yamini for your remarks, particularly on the design of CSS schemes, especially given the fact that we know a lot of them are on state subjects, and how you think these schemes can be designed, especially in this new normal that we are in this post-Planning Commission world, how these schemes can be designed to ensure that the matters on which they deal with, health and education and so on, are actually matters that are governed well. So Yamini, over to you.
Thank you, Argo, for inviting me to this important discussion on a subject that has long been at the core of a lot of the thinking I have done on social policy and governance issues. You can't debate governance in India without encountering the dreaded centrally sponsored scheme. And the way I've interpreted this is that we are caught in this inevitable tug of war of centralization and decentralization, and it's in the interstices of this tug of war where social policy actually gets implemented. So it's a really welcome opportunity for me to reflect again on this issue and to learn from the absolutely wonderful report that Ritvika and team have put together, which is really insightful. And I've always looked at Vidhi's reports and thought to myself, CPR needs to figure out how to be able to make punchy but really crucial and important points in the way that you all do. So reading through the report, I also felt a tinge of envy and a reminder that I need to talk to you guys on that. But really, an excellent report that also puts into, I think we talk about these issues often in silos, but they're all deeply integrated. The constitutional debates, the backdrop, the context in which the evolution of the architecture of fiscal federalism took place, and how that has unfolded over the decades is such an important issue. And when we look at it from the point of view, as I do, of implementation and social policy, one often forgets this broader context in which these schemes evolved in the first place, their constitutional significance, and how they interact with the different institutions of fiscal federalism. And of course, to Dr. Singh, every opportunity to hear you is a lesson in a masterclass actually in fiscal federalism, as was today. And so much of what you said both helps frame and understand the context and realities of the fiscal federal architecture today, but also pointing to the very, very crucial and provocative context in which we find ourselves today. I think we are at an important point in the history of fiscal federalism in India, a point that could actually be an important opportunity to re-architect and address some of the challenges that we have confronted. But to do that, we need to be able to know which are the right questions to ask, understand the institutional landscape and how the institutional landscape intersects with each other, and also in the very real context of the shifting dynamics of the Indian economy itself. So it was a pleasure listening to you, and I feel a little humbled at having to speak after you, because all that has to be said has already been said, but I'll give it a try anyway. I think I want to say two things before I respond to the specific points, questions, Argo, that you talked about. One, every time I've encountered this challenge of centrally sponsored schemes, the politics comes at the heart and center of it. And Dr. Singh referred to this in his remarks as well, and comes in the following way. What has always puzzled me is how a polity that, particularly in the coalition era of the 90s and 2000s, that was increasingly decentralizing, where states were at the center, where state regional parties played a very important important role in national governance and use that opportunity to extract benefits for their states and their parties in different ways. Yet, despite inevitable complaining, I mean, if you look back even at the 14th Finance Commission report, I record our Prime Minister as Chief Minister saying it should not be 32%, it should be 50% devolution to states. Centrally sponsored schemes have always been the bane of all state governments. Complaining is part and part, goes back to the Sarkaria Commission and before. Yet at that core juncture, when regional parties played such a pivotal role in national governance, the complaints never translated into a political momentum for shifting the architecture of our fiscal federal structure. And, you know, even though the Planning Commission was always lamented as this sort of behemoth of and at the heart of the centralizing tendencies, nothing really moved in that direction. And every time we would talk to state governments, the complaints were rife. And yet there didn't seem to be any movement. And one of the reasons why this seems to have happened, that despite decentralizing polity, there was a relative comfort with a relatively more centralizing fiscal architecture at a time also, I must add, where states were becoming the forefront of innovation and change in social sector reform. So whether it was the public distribution system, whether it is education, whether it was even rural roads, housing, all of these different programs, innovation was taking place at states, and state elections were very much anchored around welfareism. So the capability of chief ministers to demonstrate good quality public service delivery or effective welfare delivery meant that you get a Raman Singh that comes back 3 times, you get a Nitish Kumar that came back, just in the JDU sort of configuration twice, and so on and so forth. So welfare politics was at the heart of state politics, and innovation was taking place there. Yet everyone complained about their hands being tied by centrally sponsored schemes and didn't do much about it. I think part of the answer lies in how the politics of centrally sponsored schemes played out and how it actually allowed for a very comfortable federal balance in the following way. If you look at CSDS data, and the political scientist Louise Tillon and her co-authors have pointed this out, you see that in fact for many centrally sponsored schemes, it was the state chief ministers that were able to walk away with full credit for implementing schemes well. So even the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which in 2009, in that 2005 to 2009 phase was very much seen as a UPA sort of flagship, it was opposition states of the time, the Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, which was run by the BJP, that were at the forefront of delivering this scheme well. And in fact, it was these states that were, these chief ministers that were being rewarded for effective implementation of the scheme. So, and don't forget, NREGA had to be renamed Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the impossible acronym of MNREGA, because states were getting way too much credit and the UPA was beginning to feel this is our scheme. What happened? Why aren't we getting the benefits? And I think that allowed for a very comfortable federal compact where credit could be taken when a scheme was implemented well by the state political architecture without it having to put too many of its own resources. So the other really interesting thing is that if you look at how center-state fiscal balance was being played out, these centrally sponsored schemes were meant to be top-ups to states specifically for non-wage expenditure. But what states began to do is that they began to use these schemes as substitutes for wages. So Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, you talked about it a little in your opening remarks, was specifically meant for non-wage expenditure. Teachers' salaries were not to be part of the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. If you look at what the allocation of funds looks like now, 25 to 30%, and in some states even more percent of that fund, all for teacher salaries, is paid through Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. So there's a nice substitution effect. States are able to implement social policy programs without dipping into their resources, using centrally sponsored schemes to substitute. And it sort of suited the politics really well, which I think is one of the reasons why, although there was a lot of complaining, there wasn't effective politicization and effective action, even when state parties, regional parties had an important say in national politics. Similarly, blame could be attributed the other way around. So think back to the 2009 or 2010 UPA elections. Mayawati complaining, I couldn't implement Narega because UPA didn't give me enough funds, release the funds on time. And the Congress party campaigning in UP saying, we gave you Narega, but Mayawati did not implement it. So again, the politics of credit taking and blame gaming played an important role in maintaining that federal compact. And I think the one thing that is shifting now is precisely what Dr. Singh was alluding to. As we are moving into a technology-driven delivery architecture, where schemes can actually be directly attributed to by cutting out layers of implementation at the grassroots, the presence of the political structure at the top delivering these schemes starts becoming more and more visible. So the big change in the 2019 elections is for many of the centrally sponsored schemes across states, which whether opposition states or BJP states, you saw credit now being directly attributed to the national government for implementation of these schemes. And this is also a time when you're beginning to see state governments resisting certain kinds of centrally sponsored schemes and putting their own names onto it as well. So I think there is a moment of a new politics that is beginning to play out, which may have some impact on reshaping the political dynamics. But at the same time, this ability to grab credit incentivizes national governments, as it always has been from the 1970s on, to continue in the practice of centrally sponsored schemes because it is an effective electoral strategy. So ultimately, resolving the challenge of centrally sponsored schemes requires a very deep discourse with the politics. And I think the institutional shifts that Dr. Singh was talking about, the GST Council, the Planning Commission, moving away actually now adds a more complicated politics here, because we do not have a political institutional structure where some of this can be negotiated. For all its failures of the of the Planning Commission and all of its centralizing tendencies, which I have argued consistently have been deeply problematic, you're still, at least the National Development Council created a platform for political discourse and dialogue. We don't have that now. And I think it's in that vacuum that a lot of the tensions and trust issues that between center and states are beginning to emerge. And the pulls and pressures of credit taking and blaming are unfolding without an institutional structure in which they can be debated and resolved, and a new compact can emerge. I want to say two more things here, moving away a little bit from the politics to the realities of implementation. The bulk of centrally sponsored schemes are primarily focused on social policy, which for all good reasons on first principles alone ought to be at the state level. And in fact, some of these ought to play out at the local government level. After all, social policy programs differ, their needs and priorities differ according to the developmental paths of different states. There can be no one-size-fits-all model. And when you do create a one-size-fits-all model, you end up distorting implementation significantly. So it's a worthy question to ask. Should Kerala necessarily be prioritizing Narega as part of its rural development portfolio? It's a worthy question to ask whether or not Tamil Nadu needs to emphasize urban cash transfers over a national rural employment guarantee program. It's a worthy question to ask whether Bihar wants to spend more on education than it does on health. I mean, I'm being provocative, but you know, the different developmental trajectories of states have different needs. And when you create a one-size-fits-all architecture, you end up creating a context where the incentive for money, because our bureaucracy and fiscal architecture is designed in such a way that accessing funds is important. There is also a fungibility of money. And it does mean that the implementation of these programs don't necessarily map onto the realities and the developmental needs and priorities of states. What this centrally sponsored scheme story has also done in the process is that it has atrophied the planning capabilities at state level. So when the 14th Finance Commission came in and centrally sponsored schemes were expected to fold into this expanded devolution, one of the big challenges, and quite a real challenge, was that state planning capability had actually completely disappeared, and line departments had got used to working with the planning commission and the central ministry's line department to plan and implement centrally programs in social sectors. In fact, in one of our, we did a series of interviews with bureaucrats and to try and understand why, after the mandate of the 14th Finance Commission, politicians and bureaucrats at the state level started asking for centrally sponsored schemes all the way again. It was like you asked for the cake, you got it, and now you want to now you want to take them to take the cake back away from you. And one of the things that they said is that states have now, especially states with weaker capacities, have now got used to implementing. They do not have the capability of planning. So you created a vacuum. There's a history of institutional atrophy and undermining of capabilities or lack of building of those capabilities. And now we find ourselves in a vacuum. And the fear is, in that vacuum, the social sectors will get neglected. And therefore, we want these centrally sponsored schemes back, because this is the only way we can protect our pool of funding, and we don't have to constantly go back to our finance departments to negotiate. So the absence, and you'll see this across the board, planning capabilities across most states, with very, very few exceptions, are non-existent. Planning departments are punishment departments. Bureaucrats who are there are there as punishment postings, and there simply isn't any capability, because we haven't invested in that capability to ensure that states are able to effectively build the bureaucratic capacity and administrative capacity that they need to plan and therefore implement according to needs and priorities, which then creates this vicious cycle of wanting central intervention on the one hand, but then despising that central intervention, because then you fall into the trap of being in a one-size-fits-all mode, which simply doesn't allow you to invest in ways that enable you to effectively implement schemes to your priorities. So you get absurd, and it also results in extremely inefficient expenditure. One example, the state of Bihar in the 2009 to 2012 phase was very actively implementing education programs. And these were state specific. They were very closely associated with the chief minister. He had his own scholarship programs with his name attached to it, uniform programs and other such schemes with his name attached to it. The right to education through the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan also had line items for scholarships, for uniforms, for transportation. So when the state planned, they asked for money not for these line items, but for other things that they wanted to spend on. They come to the central government to discuss their annual plan, and the central government says, but you've not allocated money for transportation, for scholarships, for uniforms. Therefore, you have to spend, we are going to give you money for those at the cost of some other money that you were requesting. They receive these monies, but the chief minister wants to spend his own resources on programs that he can associate with his name. It's electorally sensible, and that's how local politics should and must work. That's democracy. So these three very crucial line items remained unspent. And because in our expenditure management system, you can't move line items up and down once they get approved, this was just unspent money, completely inefficient for a state that desperately needs a lot more financial resources to improve its education system. So, so it is this, so the lack of planning capability, which creates a vicious cycle for a one-size-fits-all model of centrally sponsored schemes, builds in its own inefficiencies to give you the perfect storm of an inefficient and frankly a system that undermines the outcomes you seek, a mechanism for financing social policies. The last point that I wanted to make, it relates to the third tier. And again, here you see exactly the same tug of war that plays out between the center and states, between states and local governments. And the big challenge that Dr. Singh also pointed out, the Central Finance Commission is under no constitutional obligation to support to financially resource local governments. It does so, it's meant to augment the State Finance Commission, the state's treasury, to be able to meet the need, what is recommended by state finance commissions. But we've seen consistently that state finance commissions haven't done their job because state governments want to hold on to their resources in much the same way as the central government wants to do with its own resources, and the same credit attribution game plays out. What do we do then with the third tier? We've now ended up in, again, an extremely imperfect world. The centrally sponsored schemes were often used as a mechanism to empower states, to empower local governments too, by trying to cut away from what was given to states by directly providing funds to local governments. Constitutionally, exactly the wrong thing to do, but it is the only source of money that the panchayats in particular were getting, because most of the centrally sponsored schemes were for rural local governments, again leading to very poor quality implementation. How do we work through this? Ultimately, it is the politics of the state that has to prepare itself to effectively both be open to building its own capabilities to make the best use of expanded devolution, which is now happening. And at the same time, it has to develop the political maturity to be able to effectively delegate and devolve responsibilities to the third tier in ways that ensure that the Central Finance Commission is augmenting, not supplementing or substituting for what the states should be doing. This requires deep political maturity. It requires the conversation on fiscal federalism in India to move away just from a discourse amongst economists and constitutional lawyers, but to firmly enter the political domain. And perhaps the only way to do that is to revive the political institutions that we have for interstate and center-state dialogue and discussion, which is the Interstate Council. I think the absence of these institutions creates vacuums in which deeper centralization can foster, and then we look for options to substitute or make up for other institutional failures, and end up in precisely the conundrums that Dr. Singh was talking about, particularly visible with the third tier. Is it for the Central Finance Commission to be doing what the states should be doing? But if they don't do it, then you lose, then you completely undermine and disempower the most important tier of our governance architecture. That's one of the big questions we need to figure out, we need to find answers to moving forward.
Thanks very much, Yamini. I think that was a wonderful compliment to what Mr. Singh laid out, and I'm very glad that you specifically spoke about that anecdote from Bihar, because that puts in sharp relief what's at stake. What's at stake here is ultimately education for a rural population in Bihar. So it's whether there will be money for education to be funded in a way that meets certain quality standards. And I think that's really what's at stake here, because we kind of tend to forget, talking about center and state and the real polity, that ultimately what's at stake is education and health and several other social sector issues, and how that's going to be funded and how effectively that's going to be rolled out. So I think there's a lot that we have to unpack, and I just want to tell everyone who's in the audience, who's been patiently waiting, that there is a chat box. Please do put in your questions there, and we'll try and take as many as possible. But just to abuse my position as the moderator and trying to bring some coherence into the discussion, I think there are three fundamental issues that are coming up. There are several, but I'd like to focus on three. First is this question of the real politique of centrally sponsored schemes, because I saw in both what Mr. Singh was saying and what Yamini, you were saying, is that on the one hand there is an instinct that Mr. Singh, you pointed to with the discussion with the bureaucrat, but the Prime Minister really can't say that, go and talk to the Chief Minister, as well as the political convenience of taking credit or passing the buck. So that's on the one side, which are kind of strong political reasons for the centrally sponsored schemes to continue. But on the other side, there is, as Ritvika pointed out, the law, the intention of the constitutional framers, and the Finance Commission. So the first sort of theme that I'd like to discuss is where you think this penny will drop. And related to that, which is the second, and Yamini, you ended with this, that we need better coordination mechanisms between center and state. And you did point to the rather moribund Interstate Council, but I'd like to put a question in relation to something that Mr. Singh said, that whether, or maybe alluded to, as to whether we think that it's time for the Finance Commission to be a permanent body. Because at the end of the day, that's really ultimate body that determines financial relations between center and state? And is it time, especially post the Planning Commission, for it to be a permanent body? And the third set of the questions is around the 7th schedule, whether we need to think about revisiting it, particularly now that we have 3 tiers of governance and not 2. How can we think about all these 3 tiers in the 7th schedule? So, Mr. Singh, I'm going to start with you. And I know that this question might be a little inconvenient, but since you're no longer chairperson of the Finance Commission, I can ask you this. Do you think the Finance Commission should be a permanent body?
I think that much rather that you pose this question to Yamini, because the last impression which I would like to leave is that having headed one, we are seeking to become a self-perpetuating body. We examined all this and we steered clear. But there is one proposal which is in public domain, which is there in our recommendations of the Finance Commission, which is to constitute, one of the terms of reference of the Finance Commission was, where this was a bit different than other Finance Commission, was to give a fiscal roadmap for the general government, which meant the general government means the central government and the state government. And we did suggest the constitution of an intergovernmental framework on the whole issues of fiscal policies, which means debt, which means also expenditure, which means a whole lot of things. That is part of the recommendations of the Finance Commission. And the central government has not turned this down. They said that this is going to be examined more carefully with its implications. So I'll leave that question to, in case Yamini wants to add anything more to that. But I do want to take this this opportunity to make on your other suggestions.
Singh, I'll just come to that in one moment, as in just if you give me one moment.
Yeah, please.
And so that I can just quickly get Yamini's view on this, because I'm cognizant of time. So Yamini, as in very quickly, since the Finance Commission is not permanent now, do you think that there needs to be a change, or do we need to think about the Interstate Council or some other kind of body, as Mr. Singh's recommendation suggested?
I think we definitely need we are currently in the midst of an institutional vacuum. We have many institutional silos that are emerging. The GST Council is one. The Niti Aayog doesn't have a fiscal responsibility, but it seems to play some coordination responsibility is another. And in this, we don't have a coordinated intersection. I think the argument that Dr. Singh presented was a very compelling one, which is that there is a lot that happens in the 5 years, and in that and projections may change, and in those 5 years there is a need for monitoring, there is a need for tracking, there is a need for negotiation. So whether this is in the form of a permanent Finance Commission body or an overarching governance structure that ensures coordination across the GST Council, the Finance Commission, sort of ministries of finance are supposed to monitor and coordinate with each other over the Finance Commission recommendations, and the Niti Aayog is an open question. But this absence of a coordination mechanism and an institutional space that enables that is a serious problem. I do think that there's a very compelling case, perhaps not for a permanent Finance Commission in terms of commission members and a chair, but a secretariat that consistently monitors and builds a knowledge base on how the Finance Commission recommendations have implemented. Because what happens, as happened when when Dr. Singh became commissioner, is that then you start commissioning research studies to find out how the last 5 years have gone. But there's a lot of things that could have been resolved right in the midst of those 5 years too, which would have made a big difference. There's no one owning and holding this.
Absolutely. So I think what's emerging is that perhaps we need the Finance Commission itself to be independent, but whether it can play this role and fill this institutional vacuum is still an open question. I take that entirely. So, Mr. Singh, coming back to you, you wanted to take on one of the other questions that I
No, I wanted to exactly say what Yamini has said now, that we did feel that there is a need for a mechanism which fosters meaningful dialogue, whether it should be there is one constitutional body. You have mentioned that, Yamini has also mentioned it. Based on Sarkaria Commission's report, we did have a Center State Council, but the way in which it has evolved, it has not evolved in the way in which the intentions of the Sarkaria Commission report would be. The Planning Commission, alas, which we all agreed was an extra constitutional body in a certain sense, and therefore you do need further thought on what would be a mechanism which enables this kind of a dialogue.
That's right.
I share Yamini's views that there is need for a durable consultative mechanism, not in the old mindset, but the new mindset, because challenges have changed. Opportunities have also changed. I mean, I totally, for instance, agree with Yamini that the capacity in states planning board, particularly after the abolition of the Planning Commission, is rather weak, and that we require. I mean, for instance, to give you one example why Yamini is so dead right, is the fact that you see, take an issue like debt. Debt is a principal macroeconomic anchor, which you all know, and that is central to macroeconomic stability. And the debt profile of the central government is of little avail unless we have the debt profile of the states. We need the debt profile of the general government. Therefore, each state government needs to have at least a debt and a fiscal cell to be able to do that. And that will strengthen and serve the purpose that Yamini has in mind, how to build capacity at the state level. One more last comment, since I have got Yamini, I totally agree with you on the observations which you made on the centrally sponsored scheme that were not part of Arga's question. But I want to mention to Yamini that in the rationalization, in the deep rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes, the discussions which we had more than once came around to exactly what we were discussing, that you decide on an X amount of quantum. Within that, you mention that these are the national priorities, but you give the flexibility to the states. So you provide a bouquet of choice, which would be in some ways combining the virtues of assurance of finance, comfort of the fact that these are on national priority schemes, and yet not box them into one size fits all, which was the exact thing that the Planning Commission was doing wrong and on which there is overall. So that proposal, we hope that in the spirit in which we have made our recommendations on a deep rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes, those presentations and those in-depth discussions will not be forgotten.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. There are two questions from the audience which I think would be useful at this juncture, and perhaps Yamini, you could take them. Rajesh Mahapatra and Mithilesh Jha both asked as to if we were to have this alternative mechanism that fills this institutional vacuum, then should we be thinking of something more representative than the Finance Commission, which ultimately is appointed by the center? And perhaps, if I may add my little two bits, something perhaps along the lines of the GST Council, which may be more messy, but all politics is messy and should be messy, but at least is representative. And I think, frankly speaking, has a very sophisticated structure of including both center and states. So what is your thought on that?
No, absolutely. That's why I hesitated from saying that there should be a permanent finance commission. Perhaps there should be a permanent secretariat, which has a certain technocratic role and responsibility. I think, but let me say something else. I think one of the important things that we must remember is that we are talking about center state relations in the context of an increasingly integrated and complex economy. Integrated in the sense that we have a national labor market. I mean, if there's any worse way in which we could be reminded of this, it was through the lockdown. The movement of people tells you how much labor actually moves across internally in this country, even if we choose not to document it effectively or have good enough data. We have an integrated goods and supplies market. After all, procurement in Punjab went into a complete mess in April of 2020 because West Bengal had closed down its jute mills and the gunny sacks were not available on time. It's a very integrated economy, and there is a economic efficiency argument to say, just like we said we needed a GST council, we also need to talk about a national agriculture market. We need to talk about integrated social protection. One nation, one ration card is only one example of that. So there is a huge pull for the need for greater integration between center and states for economic efficiency's sake per se. At the same time, the expectation that 20, 30 years of economic reform would get you to a place where states' developmental trajectories would converge rather than diverge hasn't taken place. Southern states are in a different place to the northern states. The eastern states are a different place to the western states. Convergence hasn't happened for a whole host of complex reasons. So we are now in a very complex context where there is a need for integration, but the fiscal needs of each state are actually quite divergent, and compensation from richer states to poorer states is in fact becoming an economic necessity. How do we balance all of this out? There is a political challenge here. At the same time, there is also an economic challenge and a big challenge to the fiscal architecture. And the only way to resolve this is by thinking about an overarching political institutional structure where this political negotiation can take place. But within that, you need to have technocratic integration. So I would my best case scenario, and this is completely utopian. I know that the Interstate Council has not actually functioned as it was envisaged. There's no political will to do so. It's a moribund institution, but it's constitutional, and it requires a political interchange, and it has a secretariat. Now imagine a context where you have that Interstate Council that actually does the high level political negotiation, but then you have councils of ministers in the structure of the GST council itself. So social protection if you have to think about urban social protection with mobility in this context, very difficult decisions have to be taken. How do you actually manage to allocate fiscal resources when a Bihari resident is lifting up his ration in Kerala? How does that actually work? You need that integration. When it comes to agriculture, and you have to think of a national agriculture market between states and borders, how do you figure these? So, think of it as the possibility of having these secretariats with ministerial representation and a consistent and constant dialogue that is both representative, brings in the technocratic elements of each of these, and ensures political negotiation. That would be my best case scenario.
Well, that's great. And I think that's perhaps where we are headed. It might take a bit of time, as these things do and must. But I'll take another question from Saurav Paul, which goes in a slightly different direction. And Ritvika, perhaps you'll be the best person placed to answer this. As Saurav asks that, what is the role that perhaps the Supreme Court can play in generating conversation? Because the Supreme Court has taken on this dialogic function, as we've seen during the pandemic, where it's asking the center and states to come together, work together on oxygen and hospital beds, and so on. So do you think that the Supreme Court even has a role in this matter of fiscal federalism?
So, or by the way, I see it, I mean, the only instance that we know of a substantive interpretation of Article 282 and of the entire interplay between 270, 280, 275, 280, and 282 is the Beam Singh judgment. Now, the judgment by itself honestly makes a very curious reading. Because the exact sort of arguments that one would pit against the use of 282 were made in that case. The bench actually made similar observations, saying that discretionary grants under Article 282 were never meant to, or it wasn't the constitutional intention that they would bypass grants under Article 275. And then ultimately, having done all of this, the Supreme Court comes to the conclusion and says, but public purpose under Article 282 should not be given a restrictive interpretation. And specifically, the court says, very curiously uses the quasi-federal nature of the Constitution and says that the specific wording of 282 empowers both the union and the states to make grants beyond their respective legislative jurisdictions. So here, and so what we find is a public purpose shaped conundrum that has now seeped into the entire discourse under 282, where high courts have also been saying that public purpose should be given an expansive interpretation once there is a combined reading of public purpose under Article 282 and the directive principles. The result is the same, where nobody really wants to venture into 282 and what public purpose can potentially mean. So I see, I mean, and currently that given that Bhim Singh is the current law of the land, possibly it's only the Supreme Court by means of a renewed look or a reimagined look at 282 can possibly say what sort of conditions can be imposed on grants under Article 282 and how high courts can also possibly follow the lead there. So yeah, I mean, until the time that doesn't happen, of course, Bhim Singh is the law of the land. But yes, possibly reimagined interpretation by the Supreme Court is the way to go forward.
Certainly, Mr. Singh, to your point of if any prime minister is visiting a distress hit area of the state, certainly the Supreme Court will not get in the way of having him help the residents of that state. Can't be said of all issues, but certainly can be said of this one. So I'm going to come to my favorite topic, which is the seventh schedule. And I think, Yamini, where you left off on the fact that we are increasingly integrated as an economy and we need to be. And even if I were to look at the Constitution, Article 301 gives the fundamental principle that trade and commerce throughout the territory of India shall be free. Of course, then it kind of gives a lot of exceptions to that, but the fundamental principle is that we are, or we are supposed to be, one market. Now, Mr. Singh, I'll put this to you. Given the fact that we need to be an integrated economy, given the fact that there is a natural trajectory that Yamini spoke about, where there is a lot of centralized, a lot of planning capacities at the center, a lot of the implementation capacities at the states, and that there is a 2.5 tier, it's really not a third tier, of local self-government that also exists. How do you see a federal division of powers in the 21st century, and how do you think that the seventh schedule can be thought of at this time?
Oh, I wish I had a easy, credible answer to this very complex question. But before I try and make any comment on that, Yamini, I agree with you on your earlier observations that you need to have a permanent technocratic domain knowledge-based aspects, because that is very important. And overarching with that, a political framework based on the kind of representative function. And there's no simple answer. The other comment which in relation to your question, and this relates to a point that Yamini had also raised, that you did mention about the fact that a person from a laborer from Bihar, he then goes to Kerala and starts working there. What are his entitlements? So I think that the one more dimension whose power we must not underrate, but must fully factor when we craft the seventh schedule. That's the limitation, but that's also an opportunity, is the seamless power of technology. And I think that one nation, one ration card, that irrespective of where he is, he can pick up his entitlement, let us say on the public distribution program. The increasing use of direct benefit transfer, which technology provides very seamlessly. A lot of these governance mechanisms technology now, the speed with which it is moving, and if we can get the full wiring of broadband connectivity, either by land or by satellite connection, to fully integrate India technologically, I think that's the time when we do need to revisit the contours of the seventh schedule. And I'll just give one more anecdote, not an anecdote, but an example. If you look at the first entry in the thing on list 2 entry of this outstanding paper, what does the first entry say? Police, railway and village police, subject to provisions of entry 2A of list 1. Police, clearly, we all know, is dominantly a state subject. Yet the complexities today are such that more money is spent by the Ministry of Home Affairs for helping state police in terms of look at the work which the CRPF is doing. Occasional deployment for every conceivable important occasion. It's a central paramilitary forces. Now, some people find this intrusive. I mean, you can always, but the fact remains that the Home Ministry officials and the Home Minister mentioned to me, we are not doing it on our own. Please understand, Mr. Chairman, that we are doing it at the behest of the states. So when we do begin to recraft the seventh schedule, we will have to look at these contemporary changes. But where I fully agree with you is that instead of continuing with this clutter, this mess, and this belief that some degree of coherence and order will emerge, let us undertake this exercise. And by the way, undertaking this exercise, something which you mentioned, Ritvika, in your paper, and Yamini will be knowing this, as long ago, the Raja Mannar Committee, which went into this issue, suggested that the seventh schedule in its current form may have outlived utility, may have outlived the kind of issues that the forefathers of the Constitution wanted to address. So I think that the seventh schedule needs to be revisited to reduce the clutter and to bring greater clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. So Yamini, last word to you. How do we see the local self-government or the third tier in a reimagined seventh schedule? Because that's one of the problems, that it is a third tier in name, but given the fact that it doesn't have any original powers and it's all delegated power from the state, that it really hasn't come into its own. So if we were to reimagine the seventh schedule, how would you think about the third tier?
So just two things. In the 2000s, a very detailed process of activity mapping was undertaken in the third tier. I was actually a research associate at the World Bank at the time when all of this was going on, and it was an intellectually really stimulating exercise. We had all these Excel sheets. We worked out first principles. We broke down every single function into its smaller activities and so on and so forth. And all these templates then went around, and you dig around in every state, you'll see this activity mapping, which clearly allocates funds, functions, functionaries in a very rational and sensible way across all tiers of government. And we know that the implementation has been what it has been. I think that at the heart of the challenge is the need for a deeper engagement with fundamentally what is the first principal function of center, state, and local. And until we don't have political consensus and social consensus, what surprises me often in social policy is how many times I find myself in arguments with those who work on education, on health, on social protection, saying that the center has given up its responsibility, when I'm saying, well, it's for the states to figure out how they should live up to this responsibility. These are state subjects, but all our lobbying is happening at the center, asking the center to. So it's only politically natural then that a new scheme, a new right will emerge at the center rather than at the state level. So this parsing out has to be done, and it has to be done through a sort of a much deeper conversation so that we don't end up revisiting, but then rebuilding institutional clutter because we're not actually fulfilling the tenets of what is expected for us to do going forward. The last thing I will say on local governments, I think the one thing that we haven't done well enough is effectively give taxation powers to local governments at this, both at the municipal as well as the rural level. The GST complicates matters. There's an interesting proposal on the table, and Dr. Singh, I think we've had conversations about this, about the possibility of GST shares actually being devolved to the third tier until the third tier isn't an active participant in India's tax regime, both as the collector of tax and therefore being accountable for the taxes that it is collecting in effective service delivery. We will not have a mature federal architecture.
That's true, and I think that is a new can of worms, which we can fully open on another day. But for today, we are out of time. So first of all, thank you very much to Mr. Singh and Yamini. I really found this to be, I know that you've done another session earlier this week, but I think this tag team works quite well. So I hope that this can continue several sessions. And to Ritvika for the wonderful presentation and the overview. I think it set the stage really well. And to our partners at the IIC, thank you very much, particularly to the tech team for putting this all together. And finally, last but not the least, to all the participants who were here on a weekday evening discussing this. I know it's Friday evening, but I can see outside that there's not much sign of COVID currently. So I hope that everyone has a good, responsible evening. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.